Hello again, everybody. By now, you probably know the news. We're going to be at home the rest of the school year. So we'll be looking for some new ways that we can still do our teaching and our learning from our homes. So I guess you can learn in your pajamas. Last time we met, we finished up a Wayside School, Sideways Stories from Wayside School. And so I thought we'd pick it up on Louis Sachar's second book, the sequel, which is called Wayside School is Falling Down. Now, I know a couple of you have been reading this on your own. You got your own copy of it for the readathon. So some of you will get a little double dip. You may have already read some of these chapters, and that's okay. You can hear them again and listen to my golden voice that you've probably been missing while we've been quarantined. So, this story, it's all the same students, or the rest of the book, it's all the same students that we've already met. Most of the characters are the same. A couple new ones get added. And then they just kind of, Louis Sachar just kind of takes some of the aspects about the characters and kind of expands on them. So, chapter 1 is called A Package for Mrs. Jewls. And you can see Louis is carrying the package up the 30 flights of stairs. This is kind of a funny chapter when Louis meets the truck driver. Louis, the yard teacher, frowned. Oh, pay attention to the beginning of this with all the garbage that Louis is picking up, and then toward the end of the chapter, you'll know why Louis is picking up all the garbage. Louis, the yard teacher, frowned. The schoolyard was a mess. There were pencils and pieces of paper everywhere. How'd all this junk get here, he wondered. Well, I'm not going to pick it up. It wasn't his job to pick up garbage. He was just supposed to pass out the balls during the lunch and recess and make sure the kids didn't kill each other. He sighed. Then he began cleaning it up. He loved the children at Wayside School. He didn't want them to play on a dirty playground. As he was picking up the pencils and pieces of paper, a large truck drove into the parking lot. It honked its horn twice, and then twice more. Louis ran to the truck. Quiet, he whispered. The children are trying to learn in there. He pointed at the school. A short man with big, bushy hair stepped out of the truck. I have a package for somebody named Mrs. Jewls, he said. I'll take it, said Louis. Are you Mrs. Jewls? Asked the man. No, said Louis. I have to give it to Mrs. Jewls, said the man. Louis thought a moment. He didn't want the man disturbing the children. He knew how much they hated to be interrupted when they were working. I'm Mrs. Jewls, he said. But you just said you weren't Mrs. Jewls, said said the man. I changed my mind, said Louis. The man got the package out of the back of the truck and gave it to Louis. Here you go, Mrs. Jewls, he said. Oh, Louis grunted. It was a very heavy package with the word fragile was printed on every side. He had to be careful not to drop it. The package was too big. Louis couldn't see where he was going. Fortunately, he knew the way up to Mrs. Jewls' class by heart. It was straight up. Wayside School was 30 stories high with only one room on each story. Mrs. Jewls' class was at the very top. It was Louis's favorite class. He pushed through the door to the school, then started up the stairs. There was no elevator. There were stairs that led down to the basement too, but nobody ever went down there. There were dead rats living in the basement. That's another chapter for us. Somebody actually does go to the basement. The box was pressed against Louis's face, squishing his nose. Even so, when he reached the 15th floor, he could smell Miss Mush's cooking in the cafeteria. It smelled like she was making mushrooms. Maybe on the way back I'll stop by Miss Mush's room and get some mushrooms, he thought. He didn't want to miss Miss Mush's mushrooms. They were her specialty. A little bit of a tongue twister in that part of the story. He huffed and groaned and continued up the stairs. His arms and legs were very sore, but he didn't want to rest. The package might be important, he thought. I have to get it to Mrs. Jewls right away. He stepped easily from the 18th story to the 20th. There was no 19th story. Mrs. Arbs taught class on the 19th story, and there was no Mrs. Arbs. At last, He struggled up the final step to the 30th story. He knocked on Mrs. Jewls' door with his head. Mrs. Jewls was in the middle of teaching her class about gravity when she heard the knock. "Come in," she called. "I can't open the door," Louis gasped. "My hands are full. I have a package for you." Mrs. Jewls faced the class. "Who wants to open the door for Louis?" she asked. All of the children raised their hand. They loved to be interrupted while they were working. "Oh dear, how shall I choose?" asked Mrs. Jewls. "I have to be fair about this. I know. We'll have a spelling bee, and the winner will get to open the door." Louis knocked his head against the door again. "It's heavy," he complained, "and I'm very tired." "Just a second," Mrs. Jewls called back. "Allison, your first word is heavy." "Heavy," said Allison. Heavy. Heavy. "Very good. Jason, you're next. Tired." "Tired," said Jason. Sleepy. Tired. Louis felt the package slipping from his sweaty fingers. He shifted the weight around to get a better grip. The corners of the box dug into the sides of his arms. He felt his hands go numb. Actually, he didn't feel them go numb. "Jenny, package." "Package," said Jenny. B-O-X. Package. "Excellent," said Mrs. Jewls. Louis felt like he was going to faint. At last, John opened the door. "I won the spelling bee, Louis," he said. "Very good, John," muttered Louis. "Aren't you going to shake my hand?" asked John. Louis shifted the box to one arm, quickly shook John's hand, then grabbed the box and staggered into the room. "Where do you want it, Mrs. Jewls?" he asked. "I don't know," said Mrs. Jewls. "What is it?" "I don't know," said Louis. "I have to put it down someplace so you can open it." "But how will I tell you where to put it until I know what it is?" said Mrs. Jewls. "You can't put it in the wrong place. You might put it in the wrong place." So Louis held the box as Mrs. Jewls stood on a chair next to him and tore open the top. His legs wobbled beneath him. "It's a computer!" exclaimed Mrs. Jewls. Everybody booed. "What's the matter?" asked Louis. "I thought everybody loved computers." "We don't want it, Louis," said Eric Bacon. "Take it back, Jack," said Terence. "Get that piece of junk out of here," said Mauricia. "Now, don't be that way," said Mrs. Jewls. "The computer will help us learn. It's a lot quicker than pencil and paper. But the quicker way we learn, the more work we have to do," complained Todd. "You may set it over on the counter, Louis," said Mrs. Jewls. Louis set the computer on the counter next to Sherry's desk. He collapsed onto the floor. "Now watch closely," said Mrs. Jewls. Everyone gathered around the new computer. It had a full-color monitor and 2 disk drives. I laugh at this part because clearly the book was written a long time ago, that made it fancy that the monitor was in color and it had disk drives. Computers don't even have disk drives anymore. Mrs. Jewls pushed it out the window. They all watched it fall and smash against the sidewalk. "See," said Mrs. Jewls, "that's gravity." "Oh, now I get it," said Joe. "Thank you, Louis," said Mrs. Jewls. "I've been trying to teach them about gravity all morning. We had been using pencils and pieces of paper, but the computer was a lot quicker." That's the end of Chapter 1. Next up, Chapter 2, Mark Miller. Mark is a new student who comes to Wayside School, although there's a little confusion over Mark Miller's actual name. All right, I'll see you back for Chapter 2.